Have you ever noticed something difficult to put into words? A sensation that begins as a whisper and grows into a deafening silence. It starts with a realization that the more deeply you understand yourself, the less connected you seem to feel with the world around you. Conversations that once excited you, topics that used to fill hours of your time, now feel inexplicably dull, like a song you've heard 1,000 times until the melody has lost all its magic. Relationships that once brought a sense of comfortable familiarity are suddenly reduced to a thin layer of surface interaction, leaving you feeling like an observer in your own life. And somewhere deep inside, in the quiet hours of the night, you begin to wonder, am I becoming cold? Am I slowly losing my ability to connect with the people I once loved? Is this what it feels like to go numb? If we look at this through the lens of Jung, the father of analytical psychology, the question itself is misdirected from the very beginning. The issue you are facing is not that you no longer like other people, though it certainly feels that way on the surface. The issue is that you no longer perceive people from the same level of awareness as before. You have moved. You have shifted your psychic gravity. When the process of what many call awakening or individuation begins, you do not simply gain more information or a few new hobbies. You undergo a fundamental restructuring of your perception. You start to see what you once overlooked, the unconscious motives, the recurring patterns of self-sabotage, and the complex social masks or personas that people wear just to function within their social circles. Once you have seen through the architecture of these masks, you cannot return to the same unguarded, innocent way of seeing. It is like a magician's trick. Once you know where the coin is hidden, you can never again experience the simple wonder of the illusion. In our exploration today, we will not rush to conclude that you are becoming distant, cynical, or withdrawn. Instead, we are going to carefully unpack each specific sign of this state to understand what is truly happening within the machinery of your psyche. We will explore why that feeling of distance may not be a loss at all, but rather a profound sign that you are entering a phase of transformation that very few people are willing to endure. This is the weight of awareness, and it requires a new way of being in the world. To understand why this happens, we must first look at the collective unconscious and the roles we are all assigned from birth. Most people spend their entire lives playing a part in a play they didn't write. They react to scripts handed down by parents, culture, and trauma. When you begin to wake up, you essentially stop reading the script. You stand on the stage while everyone else is still in character. And suddenly, the dialogue feels hollow. You see the strings, you see the stagehands in the wings, and the drama that everyone else takes so seriously begins to look like a poorly rehearsed farce. This isn't arrogance, it's a shift in frequency. You are no longer tuned into the station of performing, and as a result, you find it harder and harder to listen to those who are still broadcasting from that place. The first major shift occurs when you realize that people do not act on what they say. This is a subtle movement in your consciousness, yet it is powerful enough to overturn the way you see every human interaction. You begin to feel less at ease with what others say, not necessarily because they are lying in a malicious sense, but because you can sense a clear, vibrating gap between their words and the way they actually live their lives. In the past, you might have been persuaded by well-crafted phrases, reasonable promises, or expressions of virtue that seemed just right. But after passing through a deeper stage of self-awareness, you begin to realize that a person's words are often the last place where truth resides. Truth is heavy, words are light. From Jung's perspective, the persona is the social mask each person wears to function within relationships. It is a functional necessity. We need a persona to navigate the world without exposing our most vulnerable core to everyone we meet. It is created to fit in, to be accepted, and to avoid unnecessary conflict. But the tragedy of the modern condition is that most people live too long within that mask. They gradually begin to speak about the image they wish to become, rather than the person they truly are. They become the mask. And here, a subtle misalignment begins to form that becomes unbearable to the person who is awakening. Words reflect the ideal, the should, and the would-be, while behavior reveals the raw nature. You start to notice that the person who talks most about peace is often the most chaotic internally, and the one who preaches honesty is the one most terrified of their own secrets. You once believed in words with a kind of childlike faith. You once thought that if someone said they valued you, their actions would naturally follow that declaration, like a shadow follows a body. But certain experiences, perhaps a series of betrayals or a sudden moment of clarity, have slowed you down. You've begun to watch the feet, not the mouth. Someone claims to value respect above all else, yet in moments of genuine conflict, they easily hurt you by interrupting, dismissing your perspective, or falling into a punishing silence as if you do not exist. Someone says they want a deep, soulful connection, yet they only show up when things are easy, light, and entertaining, withdrawing the very moment that honesty or emotional labor is required. These moments are not always loud or dramatic. They don't have to be. They are often quiet, mundane instances of inconsistency, but they are enough to make one thing unmistakably clear. Behavior always comes before explanation. This sense of misalignment is where the internal shift begins. You find yourself no longer reacting strongly to the emotional bait of words. Instead, you start observing the long-term patterns of behavior. You are no longer drawn to what is displayed in a fleeting moment of charisma, but to what is sustained over the grueling passage of time. And when you do this long enough, you come to see a simple but difficult truth that most people spend their lives avoiding. People do not act from what they say they believe, but from what operates within them at an unconscious level. From a psychological standpoint, this reflects the massive chasm between self-image and behavioral patterns. A person can construct a very clear, beautiful image of who they are, what they believe, and how they wish to live. They can post it on social media, they can talk about it at dinner parties, and they can even believe it themselves. But when faced with real, raw emotions, especially uncomfortable ones like fear, insecurity, or old wounds, they react according to patterns that were formed in childhood, long before they had a philosophy. That is why words can change as quickly as the weather, but repeated behavior is the bedrock of the soul. Once you begin to look at that repetition, you are no longer easily convinced by what is said. This realization does not feel comfortable. It feels like a cold wind. It creates a natural, psychic distance between you and others. You still listen. You haven't lost your manners, but you no longer believe with the same intensity. You still connect, but you no longer invest your precious emotional currency in what has not been proven through the fire of behavior. You begin to feel a profound tiredness. You're tired of perfectly appropriate conversations that lack consistency. You're uncomfortable with promises that never materialize into action. And gradually, you realize you no longer like as many people as you once did, because you are no longer liking the masks, and the faces behind them are often too afraid to show themselves. Jung once wrote a chillingly accurate observation. People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls. When a person has not faced themselves, they may still say all the right things, yet they live according to the shadows that remain unconscious. And once you have seen this mechanism at work, you cannot return to your former innocence. You can't unsee the puppet strings. This does not mean you have become a negative person or a hermit. It simply means you are beginning to see people at a deeper level, where words are no longer the center of gravity. You learn to listen for consistency, to observe the rhythm of repetition, and to let time reveal the true essence of a person. It is precisely this shift that makes it harder for you to feel close to those who are still living entirely within their persona. Because once you recognize the mask, you can no longer mistake it for the face. If any part of this resonates with your experience, whether it is a moment of no longer belonging or a gradual change in how you see your social circle. It's important to acknowledge where you are on this path. This is a lonely road, but it is the road to the self. You might be learning to be more selective, more protective of your peace. That selectivity isn't a flaw, it's a form of spiritual hygiene. Sometimes, admitting that you've changed is the most honest thing you can do for yourself. That truth can be the bridge to others who are also waking up and feeling the same coldness. That is actually just a new kind of clarity. As you stop being held in place by connections that no longer fit, a deeper movement begins. Not just in how you see people, but in how you choose to spend the finite energy of your life. This brings us to the second major sign of this transformation. You lose interest in relationships that lack depth. After an awakening, you may encounter a specific recurring moment. You still meet the same people at the same coffee shops or offices. You still sit in familiar living rooms listening to familiar stories. Yet, the feeling is no longer the same. The stories that once excited you, the gossip, the complaints about the weather, or the news, begin to fade into background noise. Connections that once made you feel a sense of belonging are reduced to a thin surface layer. And what unsettles you most is not the lack of depth in others, but the fact that you no longer want to try to maintain the facade. This is where many people misunderstand their own evolution. They think they are becoming cold, distant, or even incapable of love. They worry they are losing their humanity. But in truth, what is changing is not your capacity to love, but your unconscious standard for connection. Your internal minimum requirements have been restructured. Before you ever looked deeply within, you could feel satisfied with relationships built on mere familiarity, shared history, or repeated interactions that required zero vulnerability. You were okay with fine. But once you begin to recognize the hidden motives beneath human behavior, and once you can sense the difference between authenticity and pretense, you can no longer pretend not to see the vacuum. A shallow exchange now becomes something that physically and mentally drains you. It's no longer just boring, it's exhausting. At this point, your inner world has moved beyond what surface-level interactions can nourish. Think of it like someone who once lived on simple, processed meals. After they have tasted the richness of complex, whole flavors, their palate changes forever. They can no longer return to the old food and find the same sense of satisfaction. The issue isn't that the food changed. It's that the person eating it has developed a more refined sense of taste. The same applies to your soul. You have tasted the depth of your own psyche, and now, small talk feels like starving at a banquet of crumbs. In the analytical psychology of Jung, a person is driven by an inner economy of energy which he called libido in a broad sense, psychic energy. Your psychological energy is not unlimited. How you allocate it reflects your level of inner development. Before an awakening, you tend to invest massive amounts of energy in maintaining an image, preserving a false harmony, and ensuring that you belong to the tribe at any cost. But as the process of individuation begins, the process of becoming who you truly are, that energy is gradually withdrawn from the external world and redirected toward the internal task of self-discovery. This shift is almost always irreversible. Relationships without depth begin to feel expensive. Every time you enter a conversation where you must hide your true thoughts to avoid making a scene, every time you nod along with things you no longer resonate with, every time you maintain a version of yourself just to keep a connection alive, you are spending energy you no longer want to waste. You realize that some relationships exist only to fill time. Some conversations exist only to avoid the terrifying weight of silence. And some forms of closeness are, in truth, just ways of avoiding the internal work that both parties are too scared to do. Jung famously said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." This applies to our friendships and family ties as well. When you become aware of the unconscious dynamics within your relationships, the power plays, the codependency, trauma bonding, you are no longer pulled into them blindly. You begin to see what is a genuine soul connection and what is simply the repetition of an old, tired pattern. And once that clarity appears, your interest in what no longer aligns naturally fades away. You don't have to try to distance yourself. The distance happens on its own, like two ships drifting apart because they are caught in different currents. At this stage, those who awaken often feel a profound sense of emptiness. They look at their phone and realize they don't want to call anyone. They look at their calendar and feel a sense of dread at upcoming social obligations. But it is vital to understand this. Losing interest in shallow relationships does not mean you are closing yourself off from the world. On the contrary, it shows that you are finally opening to an entirely different standard of connection. You are no longer seeking empty presence, just having someone there, but you are seeking understanding. You no longer need quantity, you crave authenticity. You are no longer drawn to what is easy, but to what is meaningful. You must learn to accept that not everyone can go with you into this depth. This isn't a loss. It is a necessary separation. Like descending into the deep ocean, you will no longer see the creatures that can only survive at the surface. You have entered an environment they cannot inhabit. As you withdraw your energy from superficial connections, you don't just change how you interact. You change the very way you perceive the people around you. What once was enough to make you admire or trust someone now begins to reveal other, darker layers. This leads us to the third sign of awakening. You stop idealizing people when the shadow emerges. There comes a point in your development when you look back at people you once admired, people you might have placed on a pedestal, and you realize something difficult to accept. You never truly saw them. You saw a version of them created by your own mind. You saw a projection. This version was filtered, highlighted, and stripped of anything that made you uncomfortable. But when the light of your own awareness begins to grow, that artificial light fades. What appears in its place is not necessarily a bad person, but a real one. They are complex, contradictory, flawed, and no longer aligned with the perfect image you once held. This is the moment the shadow enters your awareness. And it's not just their shadow you're seeing, it's your own. The part of you that needed them to be perfect in order for you to feel safe or inspired is finally being integrated. From Jung's perspective, humans have a natural tendency to project unconscious aspects of themselves onto others. We do this especially with qualities we haven't yet dared to acknowledge in ourselves. When you meet someone and feel they are special or rare, it's highly likely you are seeing your own unrealized potential or your own hidden desires reflected back at you. At an earlier stage of life, this projection forms the basis of almost all attraction and inspiration. We attach ourselves to people because they represent what we want to become. But as you grow, you can no longer sustain that projection. You start to notice the cracks. You see the contradictions between their words and actions, the moments of petty insecurity, or the ways they fail to live up to the hero narrative you wrote for them. Disillusionment is a painful process, but it is a holy one. It's important to distinguish that you aren't disappointed because the other person changed. They were likely always that way. You are disappointed because the image you created of them can no longer stand the pressure of reality. This is a crucial distinction. When the shadow appears, it doesn't destroy who the person is. It destroys your illusion of them. And once that illusion is gone, you're forced to face a deeper question. Are you connecting with a real human being? Or are you just in love with a ghost of your own making? Imagine looking at a statue in a museum, perfectly lit from one specific angle. From that vantage point, every line is flawless. But if you walk around the statue, or if the light shifts to the side, you begin to see the tool marks, the asymmetries, the places where the stone is discolored. The statue hasn't changed, but your perspective has. Once you see the flaws, you can't go back to the perfect view, Jung said. Everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. When you understand this, you are no longer shocked when good people act in ways that contradict their public image. You stop being surprised by the secret drinking, the hidden tempers, or the subtle manipulations. Instead, you begin to see people more fully, not as good or bad, but as a whole that contains both light and darkness. This shift is what effectively ends idealization. You no longer search for a perfect mentor, a perfect partner, or a perfect friend because you finally understand that such a thing doesn't exist. You stop being wowed by first impressions or charismatic speeches because you know a person cannot be understood by how they appear in their best moments. You might meet someone confident and articulate, And in the past, you would have followed them anywhere. Now, you look for the control in their voice, the need for validation beneath their confidence, and the defensive reactions they have when they are challenged. This doesn't diminish your ability to connect. It actually makes it more honest. You are no longer attracted to the surface light. You begin to sense the inner structure of a person. You stop caring about how someone appears in your eyes and start caring about whether they are honest enough to face their own shadow. This is where the loss is felt most acutely. When you stop idealizing, you lose that spark or awe that once made social life feel like a movie. There is no more feeling of this person is a god. In its place is a calm, sometimes heavy observation. This can feel like distance, but it's actually the beginning of true intimacy. You are no longer loving a projection. You are beginning to see a person. And that requires you to face your own shadow, realizing that what you once admired in them might be what you haven't yet dared to live yourself. As the illusions dissolve, it isn't just your view of individuals that clarifies. Your entire worldview begins to shift in a way that makes fitting in nearly impossible. This is the fourth sign. You no longer share the same way of seeing the world as the majority. Jung emphasized that we don't live in a shared external reality so much as we live within a structure of perception. This structure is built from your experiences, your beliefs, and your personal unconscious. When that structure undergoes a seismic shift, the way you interpret every single thing around you changes with it. You no longer see an action as just an action. You see the tectonic plates of meaning moving beneath it. When someone describes a situation to you now, say a conflict at their job, they might focus on who is wrong, who is mean, or who deserved to be fired. Meanwhile, you find yourself observing something entirely different. You're watching how their own emotions are being triggered, how they are repeating a pattern from their childhood, or how the entire situation is a perfect reflection of their own internal chaos. These two perspectives, the literal and the psychological, do not just disagree, they exist in different dimensions. And when perspectives don't overlap, connection becomes incredibly difficult. There are conversations you once joined naturally, debates about politics, complaints about the system, or social posturing, that now leave you feeling completely out of place. It's not that the content of the conversation is wrong, but that the frame is too small for you. You are no longer interested in the binary of right versus wrong. You are no longer drawn into surface-level narratives that cast people as villains or victims. You find yourself seeking a dialogue that reaches the essence of an issue, but you quickly realize that not everyone is ready or even capable of going there. Jung once remarked that thinking is difficult. That's why most people judge. Judgment is a reflex. It's an energy saver for the brain. It's easy to say, that person is bad. It is much harder to say, that person is a complex manifestation of inherited trauma and cultural conditioning, much like myself. When one person operates through reflexive judgment while you are trying to analyze the inner structure of experience, you simply cannot meet at the same point. This can't be fixed by talking more or explaining your side. The issue isn't a lack of information. It's a difference in the operating system used to process that information. Think of it like this. If two people are looking at the same rejection, one sees an insult to their ego, a sign they aren't good enough. They feel a need to judge the person who rejected them to feel better. You, however, might see that same rejection as a natural byproduct of clashing values, or perhaps an invitation to look at your own fear of abandonment. These two ways of seeing create two entirely different universes of experience. When you share your perspective, you might be met with blank stares or even hostility, not because they are stupid, but because they have never been taught to look at the world through the lens of the soul. As a result, you begin to realize that not every relationship is meant to grow indefinitely. There comes a time when the shared foundation of understanding that once held a connection together simply evaporates. You might still respect the person, you might still be kind to them at a holiday gathering, but you no longer feel the urge to share your heart. You no longer hope to be understood in the way you once did. This brings a specific kind of loneliness, but it isn't the loneliness of the unwanted. It is the silence of the pioneer who has traveled further than the rest of the party. When you no longer operate within the same frame of reference as the collective, resonance is hard to find. But this out-of-sync feeling is actually a form of maturity. You are no longer a mirror reflecting what everyone else wants to see. You are becoming a lens. You stop trying to make every conversation meaningful and start accepting that people are at different stages of their own internal journey. Not all paths are meant to intersect forever. You don't need to force yourself back into an old, cramped perspective just to belong to a group. You only need to accept the difference. And from that place of acceptance, you can decide where you truly belong. If you no longer see the world as you once did, it's not a sign of failure. It's a sign that you have finally stopped looking at the map and started looking at the terrain. When your perspective shifts, the distance between you and the collective doesn't just stay in your head. It begins to manifest in your physical and emotional reactions to everyday interactions. You start to notice things you once ignored or accepted as just the way things are. This leads to the fifth sign. You become highly uncomfortable with boundary violations. After an awakening, have you noticed yourself becoming allergic to behaviors you once tolerated for years? Suddenly, questions that are too personal feel like an invasion. Unsolicited advice feels like an insult. Even the subtle way someone tries to dump their anxiety onto you begins to create a physical sense of recoil. The most important thing to realize here is that these behaviors from others are not new. People have likely been crossing your boundaries since you were a child. The difference is that before this shift in awareness, you didn't feel your own boundaries clearly enough to know they were being violated. You were porous. You lived in a state where your psychological space was merged with everyone else's. You agreed easily, you adapted to others' moods, and you adjusted your own needs to maintain harmony. You didn't call it being walked on. You called it being nice or flexible. But as you return to your inner world, through the process of awakening, you begin to inhabit your own skin. You start to recognize what you truly feel versus what you've been told to feel. And in that clarity, you realize a hard truth. Not all closeness is actual connection, and not all care is actually respect. Sometimes what people call care is actually a subtle form of control or an attempt to make themselves feel better by fixing you. From a Jungian perspective, inner development, individuation, is fundamentally about separating yourself from the collective and from unconscious external influences. When your boundaries are blurred, you are like a leaf in the wind, pulled into other people's emotional storms and guided by their expectations. You lose your center. But as you understand your own psychological structure, you realize you don't have to respond to every text immediately. You don't have to fulfill every request just because someone asked. You don't have to allow everyone into your inner sanctum. The discomfort you feel now isn't a sign that you're becoming difficult or prickly. It's a sign that a healthy psychological skin is finally growing. Imagine living in a house where the front door was always off the hinges. Anyone could walk in, rearrange the furniture, scream or stay the night. And you were so used to it that you didn't think it was weird. Then one day, you decide to put the door back on and lock it. The people who were used to walking in whenever they wanted will call you cold or mean. But you haven't changed into a bad person. You've just realized that the house belongs to you. Jung noted that people who avoid facing their own souls often try to live through others. They step into your space, offer advice they haven't followed themselves, or try to manage your life to avoid looking at the chaos in their own. If you lack boundaries, you become the trash can for their avoided emotions. When you stop being that trash can, they might get angry. They might say you've changed. And you have. You are no longer willing to play the role of the perpetual shock absorber for the world's neuroses. Think of the familiar scenarios. Someone asks a probing question about your personal life that you aren't ready to answer. In the past, you would have answered out of a fear of being rude, leaving you feeling slimy afterward. Now you pause. You feel the discomfort and you realize, I don't owe them this information. Or someone gives you advice that is really just a projection of their own fears. In the past, you would have listened politely while your internal energy drained away. Now, you see it for what it is, their fear, not your reality. This inner clarity allows you to say no without the crushing weight of guilt. You realize that a boundary isn't a wall designed to keep people out. It's a gate designed to let the right things in. When boundaries are clear, relationships actually become healthier because they are based on mutual respect rather than a messy fusion of two people's problems. You no longer need to sacrifice your inner peace just to keep a relationship on life support. As your boundaries solidify, you might find that you simply can no longer remain in your old environments in the same way. The social circles, the family dynamics, the workplace cultures, they all feel like clothes that are 3 sizes too small. Creating distance is no longer just an emotional mood. It becomes a structural necessity. This is the 6th sign. You feel a desperate need to step away from others to restructure your inner world. This isn't the rebellion of a teenager. It's the retreat of a soul that is undergoing a massive renovation. In Jung's work, this is a core phase of individuation. It is the process of separating from collective patterns, the ways of thinking and living that were handed to you by society, to begin forming an identity that truly belongs to you. To do this, you cannot stay immersed in the noise of others. You need a space quiet enough to hear the sound of your own heartbeat. Most of your life's decisions were likely shaped by your environment. You chose the safe career, you wore the right clothes, and you adjusted your personality so as not to appear weird. But as you wake up, you realize those choices didn't come from you. They were just adaptations to survive. Stepping away is an act of returning. It's like standing in a crowded room where 5 different stereos are playing 5 different songs at full volume. Stay there long enough, and you'll forget what music you actually like. You might even start singing along to a song you hate just because it's the loudest. But when you step outside into the silence, the noise of the world begins to settle like dust after a storm. What remains, though it might be faint at first, is your own song. At this stage, you might find yourself cancelling plans. You no longer feel the FOMO, fear of missing out, that used to drive you. You become more selective with your time and energy. You might spend entire weekends alone, not doing anything, but just being. Others will inevitably misunderstand this. They might think you're depressed, antisocial, or going through a phase. But you aren't closing yourself off. You're restructuring. If you want to fix the foundation of a house, you can't keep hosting parties in the living room while the work is being done. You have to clear the space. You have to pause the normal activities so you can see what's actually underneath the floorboards. The inner world works the same way. When you begin to look into the deeper layers of your psyche, your traumas, your shadows, your true desires, you need an undisturbed space to process them. This process can be lonely, but it is a sacred loneliness. It is the state of being alone with yourself, perhaps, for the first time in your life. Most people are terrified of this silence, because, in the silence, all the things they've been running from finally catch up to them. But if you have the courage to stay in that space, you'll find that the silence isn't empty. It is pregnant with clarity. In the quiet, you begin to see the patterns that have repeated throughout your life. You see why you chose the partners you did, why you let people cross your boundaries, and why you were so afraid to be seen. And for the first time, you have the actual choice not to repeat those patterns. When this restructuring is complete, you don't return to the world as the same person. You return with a spine. You return with an inner structure that no longer depends on external validation. You no longer need a room full of people to tell you you're okay, because you've done the work to know it for yourself. You no longer have to trade your soul for a seat at the table. Ultimately, this journey of disliking people after an awakening is not a journey toward hatred or cynicism. It is a journey toward wholeness. You reach a point where you realize You cannot return to the old way of seeing people, and more importantly, you cannot return to the old way of seeing yourself. The connections that once held you together begin to lose their weight, not because they were wrong, but because they have served their purpose. You have outgrown the container. This transition can be terrifying. It feels like you're drifting into deep space, further and further away from the planet of normal social life. But understand that this is a natural part of becoming an individual. You are not moving away from people. You are moving away from what is unreal in people. You are moving away from the games, the masks, and the unconscious scripts. And in that quiet, distant space, you begin to understand that true connection isn't about filling a void or avoiding loneliness. It's about meeting another person from a state of wholeness. When you finally reconnect with the world, and you will, it will be on entirely different terms. You will no longer look for friends to pass the time with. You will look for kin to share the truth with. You will no longer be satisfied with 100 shallow acquaintances. You will seek the 2 or 3 souls who are also brave enough to live without their masks. Your social circle will be smaller, but it will be solid. It will be made of people who don't just say they value you, but whose lives are a consistent reflection of that value. From this awakened moment forward, you will move through the world with a calm observation. You will see the shadows and the masks, but they will no longer trigger you or drain you because you are no longer hooked into them. You have seen the magician's trick, and while the mystery is gone, a much deeper appreciation for the real magic of human existence takes its place. You realize that the goal of life isn't to be liked by everyone. It's to be truly known by a few, and most importantly, to be known by yourself. If you find yourself in this state of disconnection, take a deep breath. You are not losing your mind, and you are not losing your heart. You are simply clearing the weeds to make room for a different kind of garden. The coldness you feel is just the cooling of the old, feverish need for approval. In its place, a steady, quiet warmth is beginning to grow, a warmth that doesn't need to be fueled by others, but comes from the fire of your own integrated soul. You are coming home to yourself, and once you are home, you will realize that you never truly disliked people. You just finally stopped liking the illusions that kept you both from being real. This is the end of the old world and the beginning of a life that is actually yours.